William Wallace stands as one of the most iconic figures in Scottish history, remembered not only for his courage, but also for the enduring symbol of freedom he left behind. His story begins in the late 13th century, in a time when Scotland was caught between internal turmoil and the growing power of England. Wallace's early years remain somewhat shrouded in mystery, but historians believe he was born around 1270, the son of a minor landowner named Malcolm Wallace. Unlike the great nobles of Scotland, Wallace came from relatively modest origins, but this did not stop him from rising to a position where his name would be remembered for centuries. In those days, Scotland was facing one of the greatest crises in its history. King Alexander III had died suddenly in 1286, leaving no direct heir except his young granddaughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. When she died at a very young age in 1290, Scotland was thrown into a succession crisis. 13 claimants vied for the throne, and rather than settle the matter among themselves, the Scottish nobles turned Edward I of England to act as an arbitrator. This decision would prove disastrous. Edward, known as the Hammer of the Scots, had no intention of simply acting as a neutral judge. Instead, he saw the crisis as an opportunity to extend his own power over Scotland. Edward manipulated the situation to ensure that Scotland was placed under his overlordship. By 1296, he had invaded Scotland, defeated the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar, and forced King John Balliol, the Scottish ruler he had installed, to abdicate. Scotland was effectively under English control. Edward placed English officials in positions of power, garrisoned castles, and imposed taxes, while treating the Scottish people as a conquered population. It was in this climate of occupation and resentment that William Wallace rose to prominence. According to one tradition, his rebellion began after English soldiers killed his wife, driving him to vengeance. While this story cannot be confirmed with absolute certainty, what is clear is that Wallace emerged as a fierce leader of resistance against English authority around 1297. At first, Wallace's campaign consisted of small-scale attacks on English outposts and officials. These raids not only weakened English control but also inspired ordinary Scots who had grown weary of submission. Wallace's boldness quickly gained him followers, and his reputation spread across the land. The turning point came in September 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Wallace, along with Andrew Murray, another Scottish leader, faced a far larger English army led by John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey. The English crossed the narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth in an attempt to attack the Scots. Wallace, displaying both patience and tactical brilliance, waited until a portion of the English army had crossed the bridge. At that moment, he launched his attack. The bridge was too narrow to allow the English to send their entire force across quickly, and those who had already crossed were trapped. The Scottish forces overwhelmed them, and chaos ensued. Thousands of English soldiers were killed, and the rest retreated in disorder. The victory at Stirling Bridge was extraordinary. Against overwhelming odds, the Scots had humiliated the English army. Wallace was celebrated as a national hero, and he was appointed Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the deposed King John Balliol. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Scotland might throw off English domination, but Edward I was not a man to accept defeat lightly. Furious at the humiliation, he personally led a massive English army north in 1298. Wallace prepared to meet him with his own forces, and the two sides clashed at the Battle of Falkirk in July of that year. Wallace arranged his men into defensive formations, known as schiltrons tight, circles of spearmen designed to resist cavalry charges. At first, the schiltrons held firm, and the English knights were unable to break through. But Edward had a powerful advantage. His Welsh longbowmen, standing at a distance, they rained arrows down on the Scottish formations, tearing them apart. Once the schiltrons were weakened, the English cavalry charged again, and this time, they broke the Scottish lines. The defeat at Falkirk was devastating. Wallace's reputation suffered, and he resigned his position as Guardian of Scotland. He disappeared from the forefront of politics, though he is believed to have traveled abroad, perhaps to France, to seek support for the Scottish cause. For several years, his role in the resistance was diminished, but he never gave up entirely. By 1305, Wallace had returned to Scotland and continued his struggle against English authority, but his fortunes had turned against him. Many of the Scottish nobles, wary of Edward's power and weary of constant warfare, began to submit to English rule. Wallace, however, refused to compromise. His defiance set him apart, but also left him increasingly isolated. Eventually, betrayal sealed his fate. He was captured near Glasgow, possibly as a result of treachery by a fellow Scot. Wallace was taken to London to stand trial. The trial itself was little more than a formality. He was charged with treason and rebellion, but Wallace made a powerful defense. He argued that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward, since he had never sworn loyalty to the English king. His loyalty, he declared, had always been to Scotland. The outcome, however, had already been decided. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was executed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors. First, he was dragged through the streets of London. Then he was hanged, but cut down before death, disemboweled, and his heart and entrails burned before him. Finally, he was beheaded, and his body was cut into 4 parts. His head was placed on London Bridge as a warning, while his limbs were sent to various cities across Britain. Though Wallace's death was horrific, it did not extinguish the flame of Scottish resistance. On the contrary, his sacrifice inspired others to continue the fight. Less than a decade later, Robert the Bruce would lead the Scots to a decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, a victory that secured Scottish independence for generations. Wallace himself became a legend. In Scotland, he was remembered in songs, stories, and poetry as a martyr for freedom. The 15th century poem The Wallace by Blind Harry turned him into a larger-than-life hero, and in modern times, his legacy has been immortalized in monuments such as the Wallace Monument in Stirling. In the 20th century, his fame spread worldwide with the release of the 1995 film Braveheart, which, although historically inaccurate in many respects, captured the spirit of his defiance and brought his story to new audiences. The true legacy of William Wallace lies not in the battles he won or lost, but in the inspiration he provided. He rose from obscurity to challenge one of the most powerful kings of Europe. He stood firm in the face of overwhelming odds, never compromising his belief in Scotland's right to govern itself. Though his body was destroyed, his spirit lived on, becoming a symbol not only of Scottish freedom but of the universal human struggle for independence and justice. Even today, more than 7 centuries later, William Wallace's name carries a resonance that few historical figures can match. He remains the embodiment of resistance against tyranny, a man who dared to dream of freedom at a time when that dream seemed impossible. His life reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the courage of one person can ignite a movement and change the destiny of a nation.